Hello everyone, and welcome back to our latest video in the English language series, where we're going to be talking today about common grammatical errors that even native English speakers often make. So it's important to keep in mind that just because somebody is a native speaker, that doesn't mean that they're always going to be accurate or correct with their grammar. So you want to avoid falling into these speaking pitfalls that we're going to talk about today to make sure that your grammar is on point. So the first example that I'm going to give you today has to do with the proper use of adverbs. So adverbs, as you know, are used to modify verbs and other parts of speech. The problem arises when native speakers use adjectives to modify those verbs and other parts of speech, when adjectives should be used to modify nouns. So to give you an example of this, I was watching the NBA Finals a few weeks ago, and I heard one of the announcers say, Steph Curry needs to run down the court as quick as possible. Now, technically, this is not a correct sentence because he's using quick, an adjective, to modify a verb, which you should not be doing. You need to be using an adverb to modify the word run. So a correct sentence would be to say, Steph Curry needs to run down the court as quickly as possible. So now we're using the adverb quickly to modify the verb run. So you need to pay attention to what exactly you're modifying in your sentence. Are you modifying a noun? In that case, it would be proper to use an adjective. If you're modifying a verb, then you need to use an adverb. So keep that in mind next time you're speaking with a native speaker or with somebody you know. So the next distinction that I want to make has to do with the difference between fewer and less. Now, this is a very common mistake that many native speakers make, and we tend to use less with just about everything in every situation, and that's not what we should be doing. So, for example, we'll say things like, there are less people on the subway today than there were yesterday. But since people is a countable noun, we should be using fewer with that sentence. So we should be saying there are fewer people on the subway today than there were yesterday. So the general rule of thumb is that with countable nouns, you want to use fewer, and with uncountable nouns such as air or water or something like that, you want to use less. So that's the general rule of thumb to keep in mind when you're thinking about that. Another distinction that I want to make has to do with the difference between that and who. So oftentimes native speakers will use that when they are referring to people. So they'll say things like, Leonardo DiCaprio is a person that is very handsome. But Leonardo DiCaprio is a person. So we want to use who in that sentence because we're talking about a person. Now, if we were talking about an inanimate object or something that was lifeless, then we could use that. But as long as we're talking about people, we need to use who in those sentences. So that's the distinction to keep in mind there. Another distinction having to do with the word that comes when we think about the difference between that and which. Now, this is a very complex case, and it has to do with the difference between defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses. So in defining relative clauses, where you're adding necessary information to a sentence, you need to use the word that. But if you're using a non-defining relative clause, which does not add any extra information unnecessarily into the sentence, then you would use which. So to give you an example of this, we could say our office, which has 2 cafeterias, is located in Cincinnati. Now, that's a non-defining relative clause because the phrase which has 2 cafeterias, that's not necessary information. We could take that clause out and the sentence would still make sense and the overall message would still be the same. But let's change the sentence this way. I could say our office that has 2 cafeterias is located in Cincinnati. Now the meaning changes. And the difference is that in the first sentence with the non-defining relative clause, we are implying that there is only one office, the office with 2 cafeterias, and we're focusing in on that one office. However, in the second sentence with the defining relative clause, that implies something different. That implies that there's more than one office, and we have to specify by saying the one with 2 cafeterias. So that's the distinction that you have to make. So are you adding necessary information to the sentence or are you not? That is going to figure into whether you use that or which. Now, the last example that I want to give you today has to do with the difference between who and whom. Now, this is a very, very tough one to get right, and a lot of native speakers will make mistakes on this one. So the key thing to remember here is that when you're forming a sentence and your focus is on the subject of the sentence, you want to use who. But if your focus is on the object of a verb or a preposition in the sentence, then you want to use whom. So consider these examples. Who ate my lunch? Well, that's a case where you need to use who because you're focusing in on who being the subject of the sentence. Now, if we were to say, to whom are you writing the letter? Well, then that's a little bit different because now whom is related to the preposition to. So it's not the subject of the sentence, so you need to use whom in that regard. So again, figure out whether you're using it as the subject of the sentence or as the object of the preposition or the verb. That's going to determine whether you use who or whom. Now, another great test that you can do to figure out whether to use who or whom is to substitute words in the sentence. So the ones that I like to use are either he or she or him or her. So if you take out the who or whom and you put in he or she, and you substitute he or she in that sentence, and it makes sense, then you know you need to use who in that sentence. But if you take out the word and you put him or her in the sentence, and you find that that makes grammatical sense, then you'll know to use whom in the sentence. That's a nice little test that I use to determine whether to use who or whom in the sentence. So those are some common grammatical errors that native speakers often make, and you want to really pay attention to these as you're going forward with your speaking and your socializing. So I hope that these tips helped you, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video. So take care and have a great day.